recording in a couple more places tomorrow for folks to spot it?
Yes, so after tonight's meeting, it will be recorded on my computer, and tomorrow it will be published to our FNESU Facebook page, and I will also publish it to YouTube and embed it directly onto our fnesu.org website. So there'll be multiple avenues for people to view this after tonight.
Perfect. Next, I thought it would be great if we could just take a couple seconds for the folks that are on the board to introduce themselves. And I'll start. My name is Jean Marie Clark. I'm a resident of Bakersfield, and I've been on the board for several years. And so I'm going to pass this over to my friend Erin, who on my screen happens to be the box to the right.
Thank you. So I'm Erin Paquette, and I also represent Bakersfield.
Well, I'll go next. I'm Mary Niles. I live in Montgomery and represent the town of Montgomery. I've been on the board for many years as well.
My name is Emily Norris. I am a resident of Sheldon, and I've been on the board a little over 3 years.
I'm Miranda Johnson, and I am a Sheldon resident, and I have been on the board for a year.
John Jejix, resident of Berkshire, and I've survived almost a year as a school board member through Zoom.
I'm Lisa Hango, and I also reside in Berkshire, and I think I've been on the board for 10 years at least.
I'm sorry, I'm having major tech difficulties on my end. Can people hear?
We can see you perfectly and we can hear you.
Okay, I'm Catherine Barnard. I sit on the Montgomery board, and I have been on the board for almost 2 years, and I am up for re-election this year.
Thank you all so much. And I think John brings up a really valid point. I have never met John or Miranda in the 3D. I've only seen you on the screen here. So thank you so much for taking the time. Really, to all of my board members, this is not an easy job, and I appreciate the time and energy you've put into it, particularly in this last year where, you know, okay, we didn't have to travel to see each other, but spending time together monthly on the screen is not an easy feat. So thank you for that. You're always been a great team to work with. So I really appreciate your time and effort and energy you put into this board. I also want to acknowledge and introduce we have most of our, I think all of our principals with us this evening. And for those of us that are viewing us from home, maybe some of you haven't ever met these principals, or maybe you haven't seen their faces before. So I think we should just take a second to let them introduce themselves. And the first one that I can see here is Christy. So Christy, if you'd introduce yourself.
I'm Christy Martin. I'm the principal at Sheldon.
And please go right ahead. Rhoda?
I'm Rhoda McClure, the principal at Bakersfield.
Lenny?
Leonard Badeau, the principal at Berkshire Elementary School.
Sandy Alexander, principal at Montgomery Elementary.
And Gabby was here. She's disappeared off my screen. Here she is. She's coming to us from a sunny, sandy beach with a beautiful palm tree.
I wish. I'm Gabrielle Lumber. I'm the principal of the Virtual Learning Academy, which is actually the SU board, but I'm here because many of our students are from all of these schools.
Thank you all so much. And then we have these boxes move and these faces come and go, but I know that I saw Michelle Taberge is here with us. Michelle, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Michelle Taberge, and I'm the Director of Student Services for the Supervisory Union.
Thank you. And our most exciting members of the team, Lynn and Morgan, if you guys would introduce yourselves.
I am Lynn Coda. I'm the superintendent for Franklin Northeast.
And I'm Morgan Dale. I'm the business manager for Franklin Northeast.
And if there's any other SU employees that are with us and don't have their cams on, if you want to introduce yourself, please go out right ahead.
I know Courtney spoke earlier, but maybe you could introduce who you are and what you do here, Courtney.
I'm Courtney Fletcher, and I am Lynn's administrative assistant and also the communications coordinator for the district.
Thank you so much. Courtney has a big job these days. This last year, communication has been so incredibly important. So thank you so much for your efforts there. Okay, so we're going to go through the budget that the board has created and is going to be presenting to you all this evening. And we're going to sort of naturally, as we go through this, stop a few times to answer questions, any questions that might come up. So feel free to, like Courtney said, use that Q&A button at the bottom to add your question in. And so I think the first step would be for Morgan, you're going to share the presentation for us.
Yep, and that should be up now.
Thank you so much. So, you know, normally in the good old days, we would be doing all of this in person, and many of these things we would be voting on in person. But given the situation that we're in, so many things, basically everything has moved to a ballot vote. So just a reminder that we have a variety of board seats that we'll be voting on, and the budget vote is this Tuesday, March 2nd. In Bakersfield, you would be able to vote at the town hall. And there are, of course, polling places in all of the other towns, which Morgan's placed right up there for me. Thank you, sir. Berkshire at the town office, Montgomery at the Grange Hall, and Sheldon at the town hall. And I know that I requested an absentee ballot, and I actually haven't submitted it yet. So I may stop by to submit that in person between now and Tuesday. So make sure if you did request an absentee ballot that you do get that in. So the first article that will be on the ballot, or if you've seen the ballot yet, is to elect a moderator for a one-year term. I don't have my ballot in front of me. I know that there is a name. I think it's Lauren Doe that's listed there. Is he the only person on the ballot?
That's correct.
Okay, perfect. And then also the second article is to vote in a clerk for the one-year term. And there is also a person's name listed on the ballot for that.
Yeah, and that's Emily Fecto, who's the current clerk as well.
And then Article 3 is for our school director, our school board members. And so there are 3 positions that are open this year, each of which is a 3-year term. There's a position for a resident of Berkshire, a resident of Montgomery, and a resident of Sheldon. And if those folks that have their names on the ballot, if you just want to speak up and say who's running for which seat, I would love that.
This is Emily Norris, and I am running again for the 3-year term in Sheldon.
And the Montgomery seat? It's either Mary or Kat.
It's Catherine, and she may still be working through some internet.
Having some technological issues. Okay, great. And then the seat in Berkshire?
That would be my seat, Lisa Hango.
Great. Thank you all. So then Article 4 is, shall the voters of the district approve the school board to expend $17,782,880, which is the amount the school board has determined to be necessary for the ensuing fiscal year. It's estimated that this proposed budget, if approved, will result in education spending of $15,574 per equalized pupil. This projected spending per equalized pupil is 4.96% higher than spending for the current year. We'll go into a little more detail about that a little further into our show this evening. Article 5 is, shall the voters of the district authorize the board of directors to borrow money not in excess of anticipated revenue for the school year, which is, we put that on the ballot every year. And then Article 6 is, shall the voters of the district establish the second Wednesday before town meeting day as the annual meeting day with Australian balloting to occur on town meeting day. And then, so our budget has been broken down into a few different categories. So this section is the pre-K category, and this outlines what our direct instruction is, and our regular education and our special education. Morgan, if you want to speak a little more in detail about this, feel free.
Sure, and this is the budget as it appears in your town book and on our website. And we're just going to go through each section and give you a chance to answer any questions once we get through the expenses, and then once we talk about the revenue and the tax rates. The only thing that I would point out here is that one thing that you'll see throughout the budget are some changes in the direct instruction line, where it looks like we're anticipating spending less here in special ed direct instruction for pre-K. When you see some lines going up and some lines going down, a lot of that has to do with the paraeducator staff and where they are allocating their time. So twice a year, we will look at what's called a time study for each of the paraeducators, and then we will sort of refigure where we're charging their time in terms of special ed versus regular ed, and then at the elementary schools between pre-K and K1, 2. And so there is some flexibility there in terms of how the principals use the staff, and then we're always playing catch up with that on the budget. But that's all I have to add on this section.
Great, thank you. So this section is our K-12 section, and this, for the regular education and for special education, includes the instruction that we do in our school buildings, and then the tuition that we pay, as of course we don't have our own high school in these towns, so we pay tuition to those schools that we send our students to. One of the things that in the discussions that Morgan and I had in advance of this meeting, one of the things that's so striking to me is the number of students that are coming into our high school this year versus the number that we have had in previous years and the number that have graduated out. So we have a pretty big increase in the number of students going off to high school this year. So of course that has an impact on what our expenses are across the board. And my son was an 8th grader last year in our little town of Bakersfield. He was one of the smallest classes. There were only 8 kids in his class. My daughter is in 8th grade this year, and that class is double the size of last year, if not slightly larger. So even just in Bakersfield, there's a pretty significant increase. I think maybe we had some significantly smaller 8th grade classes last year. Morgan, do you want to, you can speak a lot more clearly to the details in this section if you'd like to.
Sure. So on that tuition line, this year we have 50 high school seniors that NMV is paying tuition for, and we have 86 8th graders who we expect to go to high school somewhere. There is always a challenge with the way that tuition payments are structured in Vermont, in that if there's a child with one parent in Bakersfield and one parent in Enosburg, let's say, and that child has been going up through elementary school in Bakersfield, if they choose to go to Enosburg for high school, NMV would not have to pay tuition for that kid because they have a parent in Enosburg, and we would say that they're an Enosburg resident at that point. If that student went instead to Maple Run, we would be paying the full tuition bill there. So as those 8th graders come up, there's a little bit of guesswork trying to figure out where they're going to end up in school, because depending on where they show up, you may or may not have to make that tuition payment. The other wrinkle this year is that there's been a temporary ruling at the court level for a case regarding tuition being paid to Rice Memorial High School and other parochial schools. In the past, the assumption has been, since they're a parochial school, they're not allowed to get public tuition dollars. So you have some NMV students that we know about who are attending school at Rice. If this court case continues and is finalized the way we think it is, you would now start paying tuition for those kids. In terms of other big movements in this section, if you look down at the debt service line, there's a big increase there, and that is because this is the first year of the principal payment on the bond for the work that was done at Sheldon Elementary. So you'll see a pop up here, and then in subsequent years, this number will go down as we pay down that bond and the interest payments are less. You'll see direct instruction is an increase under regular ed. Again, part of that is the shift from paraeducators moving to regular ed instruction out of here, special ed instruction. We do anticipate a few additional paraeducators in the FY22 budget. And I believe in here there may also be some tuition payments for K through 8 students who will be placed out of district because of their specific needs. So that's, while it's a tuition payment, it doesn't come up in this high school tuition line. Maybe what we should do is stop there. This is the end of the expenses part of the budget. And here again is the 17 million figure that is on the ballot. And so if there are any questions now, Jean Marie or I or the principals can try to answer them.
I do have one question so far. It is, do we have any students attending high school in Canada, or is that allowed during this pandemic?
It is allowed during the pandemic. I do not know the intricacies of how they're crossing the border and if they are able to move back and forth freely, or if they are held up there. But we do have kids there. It's called Stansted College, and it looks like we have 5 students there this year.
You know, Morgan, I have fielded a question from folks sort of on the streets, as they say, around surrounding additional costs that we had to deal with due to COVID. And so I know that I've seen some of those costs come through. Do you want to talk a little bit about any impact that those like additional PPE expenses or cleaning expenses had, or how those were handled?
Sure. So as everybody knows, the schools were closed down in March of 2020. We have been incurring some COVID specific costs since then, certainly things like upgrades to our ventilation systems, even upgrades to our food service program because of the shift to moving foods out rather than serving kids in the building. As Jean Marie mentioned, things like cleaning supplies, and obviously the way we're teaching kids are different. And so we've been spending more money on devices and spending more money on materials to send home and staffing to ride those buses to get materials delivered to home. For the end of the 1920 school year, we were able to capture those costs and apply them to a grant called the CRF grant, which stands for Coronavirus Relief Fund. And so those expenses over and above what we had budgeted for in a normal year were all covered by that grant. That grant actually ran through December 30th of this year. And so we were able, again, to capture all of the expenses over and above our budget through December 30th with that grant. So the district has been kept whole. For that grant specifically, there were costs that we identified as being kind of tied to the COVID response, but we were able to reconfigure our budget so it wasn't necessarily new money going out. And for folks who've heard about the repurposing of funds, those funds would fall in that category. And what the state had done with that was to use the grant to pay for those funds, but basically shorted us the tax money that we received. So we as a district were still kept whole, but they were able to then use that money to basically keep the yield rate up, which we'll talk about later, and tax rates down for next year. Going forward for the rest of this year, we have a grant called ESSER 1, and we're going to be getting a second ESSER grant in the near future. Right now, it looks like that will easily cover the unplanned for expenses for the rest of this year. In this budget that you're voting on next week, we have a half-time nurse in Bakersfield and a half-time nurse in Montgomery who are additional positions to the budget. They're ones that we actually hired last year and paid for out of the CRF grant, and will continue to pay for this year out of the ESSER grant, but we have built those into this regular budget. And so going forward, in terms of the budget that impacts your tax rate directly, those are the only additional costs due to COVID.
I
Great.
do have another question. Sorry, Jean Marie.
No, go right ahead.
On the subject of the bond, Bakersfield has over $8 million listed in our town report as a school district bond. How is this divided up between all the towns in the district?
Okay, so I haven't seen the Bakersfield town report yet, but each of the 4 forming districts now has a bond on their building. And what the bond bank has done is kind of pulled them all together. And so there's a single bond pool, if you will, that encompasses the debt for those 4 buildings. That entire amount is included here in this debt service line. So this 539 figure includes 4 principal payments, 1 for each of those buildings, and then the interest payments tied to that. And this is the number that, as those bonds get paid down, we will see that decline over the next few years. I think Bakersfield and Montgomery are the 2 that will be paid off the soonest, but I think I don't have the exact number in front of me, but I think we still have probably 5 years on each of these.
I don't have any more questions right now.
Okay. So we've covered the expenses. This is the anticipated revenue. And a couple of things that I just want to point out. Local revenue is pretty minor for NMV. Other restricted revenue is primarily Medicaid reimbursement we get for services provided to students. State revenue is the special ed reimbursement for paraeducators, as well as the 2 small schools grants tied to Bakersfield and to Montgomery. We are anticipating a decrease in the revenue in that line. The other revenue figure, this 403, is use of the fund balance from FY20. So at the end of FY20, we had $403,000 left in the bank, if you will. The board has decided to apply all of that to the FY22 budget, primarily because of the uncertainty that we had around tax rates when we were putting this budget to bed 6 weeks ago. In a quote unquote normal year, if we have a healthy fund balance, you will usually see an article on your warning asking to put $100,000 or $250,000 away into a capital reserve fund to start building up some funds to maintain those 4 elementary schools. So I'll pause there. I don't know if there are any questions on revenue that have come up, Courtney.
Not yet, but we can give it a couple of seconds just in case.
Okay, we can come back to it. We can go to the one that everyone cares about. And so this is the chart that we use to try to predict your tax rates on your tax bill. And so I'll walk you through this and feel free to put any questions on. It's pretty arcane stuff.
Morgan, before you read this slide, I just want to ask the question because it might pertain to this, directly to this slide.
Sure.
Are taxes based on school population?
Yes, in a way, and I will go through that now. That's a good question. And so there are basically four factors that go into setting the tax rates. We talked about the budget that your board is asking you to approve next week, the 17 million. We talked about the revenue that we believe that we're going to get, just over 1 million, and subtracting the revenue from the budget, as hopefully will be approved next week, we come up with a figure of education spending. And this is the money that the district needs to get from the ed fund in order to run the schools based on the budget that has been warned. From the education spending, we next look at equalized pupils. And this is a 2-year average of the kids that you are responsible for educating. And they have different weights. So the state has decided that it's a little more expensive to educate, say, a high school kid rather than an elementary school kid, and an elementary school kid rather than a pre-K kid. And if you have students living in poverty, they may take more of a budget input than kids who are not in poverty, kids who are learning English as a second language or who are receiving special ed services. So this attempts to even the playing field with all the other districts across the state, and the state basically gives us this number. This number is now probably final. There may be a slight change, and I believe between the flyer that we sent out last week and the report that we sent out to the town books, which came out a few weeks earlier, this number had moved a little bit. If you take your education spending and you divide it by the number of equalized pupils, you get a per pupil ed spending amount. And this is really the figure that you can use to compare how much Northern Mountain Valley is spending per kid compared to any other district in the state. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But that's how the student population, the school population comes into play in the tax rate calculation. Each district comes up with their per pupil ed spending, and then the legislature sets this third factor, the dollar yield. This has moved pretty significantly since we warned the budget and we put reports in your town book. So I'll talk about that a little bit. On December 1st, the tax commissioner looks at where he thinks that the money coming into the ed fund is likely to end up. They talk to the Agency of Education and try to get a guess as to where the warned budgets are going to come in, and then they predict a dollar yield amount. This dollar yield that we're using now, 11,385, means that for every 11,385 of per pupil ed spending, you would need $1 on the tax rate to raise that money. So if we had more kids, let's say we had 500 more kids, that might put our per pupil ed spending down to 11,385, and our tax rate here would be $1. If we had fewer kids, enough that this per pupil ed spending went up to 22,730, then our tax rate would be $2. So it moves pretty dramatically with the yield. And this figure here is the last number that a House committee has sort of put on the table in terms of the legislation that's working its way through Montpelier. We likely won't know this number until May or June, but we're feeling like this is a much closer number than the one that the tax commissioner had floated and was published in your book. So dividing the per pupil ed spending by the dollar yield gets you the equalized residential school tax rate. So this is the tax rate that's applied to homesteads for all 4 towns in NMV. And I'll just stop a second there before I get into CLA and see if there are any questions on that. But again, the 3 factors so far that impact the tax rate are the budget that you pass, equalized pupils that it is used to educate, and then the dollar yield, which is the number set by the legislature.
I do have one question. What happens if not all towns vote to pass the budget? Are results pooled together?
So the results are pooled together. It's a commingled vote. And so across the entire district, the budget needs to pass. It doesn't need to pass in each individual town. It's a good question.
I don't have any questions right now, but I will let you know if one comes in.
Okay. So from this equalized residential school tax rate, each town will apply the CLA, or the common level of appraisal, before the tax rate hits your tax bills that you see this summer. And what the common level of appraisal attempts to do is to make it so that properties with equal value across all towns are paying the same on their tax bill. So if you look here at Bakersfield, their CLA has dropped to 93.03%. And so what that means is that if you live in Bakersfield and your grand list has your property listed at $93,000, let's say, the state of Vermont, looking at all the transactions statewide, they think that that $93,000 house actually has a fair market value of $100,000. Whereas in Berkshire, if your grand list has your house at $101,900, the state thinks that that property also has a fair market value of $100,000. And because they want both of those homeowners paying the same amount of taxes, they will divide the CLA into this tax rate, and the Bakersfield resident with that sort of depressed assessment will see a higher tax rate, and then the Berkshire resident with that inflated assessment will see a lower tax rate, so that their tax bills on that similar house turn out the same. And so if your tax rate is above 100%, or your CLA is above 100%, your tax rate is actually going to go down. And if your tax rate, if your CLA is increasing from year to year, that also drives your tax rate down. Whereas a CLA that is falling, as it did in Bakersfield, drives your tax rate up.
We do not have any questions.
Okay. This chart on the left side is in the mailer that we sent out last week, and then this below up here is actually from the town book, which had a little more space to show these. These figures are for last year, so that's the latest year that we have the actual approved budget figures for. And this is the amount of ed spending per pupil. So we talked about that in terms of the tax rate. It's the amount of money we need from the ed fund divided by those equalized number of pupils. And that's how you can compare one district to another. And so across the state, there's a low last year of somewhere around 13,000 here, and it goes up to a high up here of around 22,000 per equalized pupil. And again, I don't know the exact figure because again, these are last year, but you can figure that a school with equalized pupils somewhere around here would have about $1 tax rate, and a school here would have about a $2 tax rate. On this chart, we've put the Franklin County average in, as well as the statewide average. And then for the FNESU towns, there are 2 bars here in red, which was Enosburg and Richford, and 4 bars here in red, which is Bakersfield, Berkshire, Montgomery, and Sheldon. And in the blow up here, we've got some of the other towns in Franklin County. So St. Albans City, Town, and Fairfield are up here in Maple Run. Franklin, Highgate, Swanton, and Missisquoi Valley are in this band here. Georgia, Fairfax, and then Fletcher would be up here somewhere for Franklin Central. And then again, the 4 NMV towns, and then Enosburg and Richford. So any questions on that?
We don't have any at the moment.
All right. Well, you've seen this one before, but just as a reminder, the polling places and times are listed here. They are where you're going to do your normal town meeting voting. They all open at 10 with the exception of Sheldon, which opens at 7, and then all polls close at 7 p.m. And again, this year only, everything is going to be by Australian ballot. In a quote unquote normal year, the moderator and the district clerk were elected from the floor.
Thank you so much, Morgan. I think that one of the things that I'd like to do while maybe folks are thinking of questions that they wanted to add in was really just take a moment to say thank you to all of the teachers and staff members that we have in all of these buildings across the district and the supervisory union, all of the staff in Lynn's office and beyond. This year has proved to be a challenge to many of us. I think these school teachers that have really put in Herculean effort to be safe and to teach our children from their homes or from their classrooms, and have been flexible in how that teaching happens and how their classrooms are set up. I really want all of you folks to understand how much we appreciate the effort that you've put in. You know, I have friends across the country and we talk about the education that their children are getting. And it's just not comparable to what we're offering here. So it is, you know, a lot of hard work and effort that had to go into making that happen, and a lot of, you know, sacrificing of spending time with family and traveling and having time to themselves that they put into making the education as best as they possibly could this year. So big thanks from the board to all of the folks that are keeping all the plates spinning within our supervisory union.
We do not have any questions at the moment.
Well, I guess that brings us to a close then, Courtney.
I guess so.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Again, I really appreciate the effort that you've all taken to come together and to Morgan, who does so much work behind the scenes to understand these numbers and put them together for those of us lay people to try to understand them. Again, Courtney's going to post this recording in several places. Please feel free to share it with your friends and family within our voting areas so that folks can be informed voters. It really makes a big difference. If you have questions, please come forward and ask them sometime between now and Tuesday.
I do have one comment.
Perfect.
Thank you for all that you've done and continue to do.
Well, thank you again so much, everyone, for joining us. Again, my appreciation to Northwest Access for broadcasting this for us. And I hope that you all remain happy and safe and healthy. And we'll see you all at the polling place on Tuesday. Thanks all. Have a great night.